Welcome to Season 3, Episode 8 of the Database Podcast. I'm Dr. Molly Stewart, the Director of Research and Analytics Services at Education Analytics, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Vice President of Interoperability Solutions, Rosh Dhanawade, and a couple of guests who we'll introduce in a moment. We work with school districts on interoperability and data quality using the EdFi data standard. And through this work, we have come to realize that there are at least 3 different languages being spoken by people working in this space: the language of databases and code, the language of teaching, learning, and educational leadership, and the language of research, including data science and statistics. This podcast aims to bridge the gaps among those 3 general areas, because the more we understand how each group conceptualizes data-related topics, the more progress we can make towards solutions for educators and students that fully take advantage of best practices and cutting-edge knowledge in each of these fields of work.
And our guests today are principal researcher Michael Christian. I almost said Mike but it's Michael Christian, just because we're using proper names. And then research scientist Sara Hu. Welcome to the channel, and I'm glad that you all were able to make the time on short notice to join us this afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
I agree. Thank you so much. And Mike is great. So sorry about didn't mean to be pretentious.
No. That was only me making sure that you all have your correct titles and names. So before we get into it, we normally like to ask our guests how they arrived in the work that they're doing. We've had a lot of varied guests on the show, and it's always interesting for me to hear your journeys. So Mike, if you want to go first, and then Sara, once Mike is done, if you want to just walk us through your career journey, you could include your education background and then how you landed here at EA. And the journey therein would be great.
Sure. So I got my PhD in economics at the University of Michigan in 2004. After that, I worked for a couple of years at the Bureau of Economic Analysis in Washington, D.C. They're the people who make the gross domestic product and other national accounts. After working there for a few years, I went to the University of Wisconsin to work at the Value Added Research Center with Rob Meyer, where the focus was on measuring value added at the school or the classroom level. We had partnerships with Milwaukee Public Schools and Chicago Public Schools at the time. Value Added Research Center grew. We brought on, among other researchers, Andrew Rice, the current CEO of Education Analytics. And after several years of doing this kind of work at the university, the idea was, we should be doing this in the nonprofit sector. So Andrew Rice, Sean McLaughlin, Gabe Rosen, Rob Meyer, they started Education Analytics. A couple years after they started, I went and joined it, and I've been working for EA since then. And most of the work I do at EA is on measuring growth models or value-added models for partners. We have state partners like state of Wisconsin or state of South Carolina. We have district partners like Hillsborough or Pasco schools in Florida, and that's still most of what I do. And if you're listening and you're a state or a district thinking, hey, we want to have a partner for value-added models, give EA a call, because we'd love to work with you, and we've been working on it so long that there's not much that we haven't seen in that space. But more recently, as I said, as EA has grown, especially the technology aspect of EA has gotten bigger, and so I've started to get involved in that and seeing some of what the opportunities for research have been. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about, quite a bit that episode. So that comes out of background and comes into foreground. And so that's how I've been involved with this so far.
And Sara, how about you?
Yes, so I got my PhD in economics in Syracuse in 2007. After graduating, my first job was actually with VARC, the predecessor of Education Analytics. I moved to Texas in 2008 for personal reasons. Then I started teaching at University of Texas at San Antonio for, 13 years. And then in 2021, I moved to Florida. And this time I joined EA as a remote worker. So I have been in the research department for 4 years. I'm really excited working in this environment. I have been involved in quite a few research topics that is closely related to improving education in America. So my previous research topic was actually also related to attendance It was about the impact of students' social emotional learning skills on attendance. And my current research was about teacher value added on attendance outcomes.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I know I've been working with you both closely over the past year and a half about your introduction to EdFi and how it can assist with research or how you can use that for research. So I think, Mike, I think your research project was probably the first. So I would just love for you to kind of describe the experience of learning this technology as a researcher, and then in the specific context of, a research project that you have done, kind of take us through those lessons learned, challenges, things that made things easier, anything like that. And then Sara, we can go one by one, or you guys can feel free to just talk about it together. So.
Sure. Well, I mean, I can talk about my experience. When I was working on the research side at EA, I'd hear about the technology side, and I'd have colleagues who I'd worked with on value-added growth projects like Jordan Motter or Rob Little. They'd go become data engineers, work on the technology part. And I know that that's always been a substantial part of Andrew Rice, our CEO's vision. And Molly, I know it's been a large part of your vision, as well. I first started getting involved with this, like I said, to work on a project about absences and about attendance. And as far as, what was challenging about it, I'd say it was maybe just the experience of getting started, right? Like, because I'm used to dealing with data sets that we receive as flat files from states or districts. And that's usually limited to, very much a specific project. It's not this sort of open field that you have when you have all these different data out there. When you go into a data warehouse, it's just, you need the assessment data, you need the student teacher linkages, you need student demographics, whatever else you want to put in the model, and go forward with that. Here it's different. Here, instead of getting the data from a partner, you go into this warehouse, you use Snowflake to, get into the data warehouse, you use SQL to get the data from the data warehouse. And probably just getting started in the first place was probably the most substantial challenge, all right? Because, you get onto Snowflake, there's buttons, you don't know what the buttons do, you don't know where the buttons are, you don't know exactly how you get to the part where you can go in and start getting the data, you're writing in a new language, SQL, to do it. The way I would think about it is it's almost similar to being in the downtown of a new city, right? Aspects of it are very familiar. There's buses, there's roads, but your first time there, a lot of things that have been routine in the past, you have to think about, you have to learn, you have to know where the buses go, which ones go to the other side of town. You need to know which roads go to a dead end and which take you to a different place. You need to know where the grocery store is. That transition was pretty fast, though. I actually think, Snowflake has got a lot of facility, and, the data warehouse is really exciting to work with. SQL, there's always idiosyncratic things like some of the common table expressions. But, it was really a matter of figuring it out over a course of weeks rather than months. And at that point, then, you really can feel really powerful just because you have this sort of open world of data to work with all sorts of different data to focus on, as opposed to, what, the staff at the partner is working with. And so after getting over that sort of initial hurdle, actually, I felt like it became very intuitive, and it felt like it was really empowering to be able to have access to all this data and to be able to work with it. So that's what my experience was like. I did get a lot of help, though, and I don't want to underestimate the colleagues of sort of documentation written by previous colleagues who had made that kind of a transition. Like, we had this great documentation about using it, especially programming in SQL, written by colleagues like Caleb Bollinger. So I don't want to underestimate the help that I got from, the staff here at EA in making that transition too.
They were your Google Maps, to extend your analogy about being downtown. Yes,
absolutely.
I like that analogy a lot, because it does when my background is on the data side of the world, more in like the infrastructure side. And so I feel like I'm a native city navigator, but the way in which you described it is really apt and should not be lost on the audience, to be like, when you're dropped in the middle of a new set of tools and a different way of engaging even in data that you're familiar with. Like, you know how to navigate a street, but you don't know how to navigate a street to a particular destination in a brand new town. Having those guides is great. So I appreciate that imagery, Mike, because that's I can see how you would feel that way, given my travels over the last year and being in different cities every month.
Yeah, thanks. No, absolutely. But it's been great being able to work with the staff at EA, and it's just been terrific, just the extent to which this whole idea of marrying research and technology, creating new possibilities in both areas. It's and just the ability of the staff to try to facilitate that and make it easy for people to reach that. It's been terrific.
Yeah, that makes me think of a conversation that we had over the summer when we met to talk about this work. And Sarah, you were working on the beginning of a research project, and I remember you and Kayla, who Mike just referenced and was, I believe, our previous podcast guest, had quite a deep conversation to try and figure out some questions that you were having about the data. So maybe this is a good segue for you to talk about that work and, especially the way that working with the analysts team, or maybe Dee's data engineers as well, was beneficial to you.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I actually agree with Mike. I think we had two very similar experiences, the starting journey, the beginning of the journey, and also I want to express my tremendous gratitude to colleagues in EA, particularly Mike, for helping me navigate EdFi data system. But in particular, so when I first started learning how to work with the data, I ran into two main challenges. The first was simply learning how to use SQL. I hadn't used it before, so at first it felt like I was jumping into a completely new language. Fortunately, I already knew R, which made the transition much smoother than expected. It actually reminded me of when I started playing pickleball a few months ago. My tennis background, even though I was only a mediocre tennis player, helped me pick it up quickly. So SQL felt the same way. Once I recognized the patterns, it all started to click. The second challenge was understanding the structure of the data, how all the tables relate to each other and how information flows across systems. For example, when we needed to calculate daily course section attendance rates, we had to connect several pieces: school calendar dates, students' course enrollments, and their attendance events. Once we matched the students to the days they were scheduled to be in class and pulled in their attendance records, we could group everything by course section and the date to see who was enrolled and what percentage were absent. So that process helped me build a clear mental model of how the datasets fit together. And once I got that down, working with the data became much more intuitive. So in the summer, we actually talked about how to find a variable that can cover all the subjects in math and ELA. So I want to say I really feel very grateful to have colleagues in EA who can help me whenever I encounter any challenges or hurdles. So that's about my experience of how getting to know EdFi data.
I'm curious, like, with that experience behind you now, and this could be a question for either of you, your next research project or research question involving EdFi data, do you feel like you now know where to look for all these things or what you need to look for? Or do you feel like there will be some more steps in the learning process when you, say, look at a different data domain or expand your scope to something else?
Well, I think in the first challenge is, like I said, is just getting started in the first place and just even getting comfortable with the environment, getting comfortable with the programming language. And that would apply, I think, regardless of whatever I was writing about. If I was writing about attendance, if I was writing about discipline, if I was doing something involving assessments, summative assessments and interim assessments or something like that. So, I mean, obviously, there's just getting used to knowing what the data are like. That's what it's like working with any data set, right? And because what we're talking about here is not one huge data set. I mean, it's a bunch of data sets that are very detailed and interconnect very, very well. So as far as there's not going to be a need to get over that initial hurdle. But there is going to be, learning just the details of the data and knowing what the data are like. The DBT documentation is absolutely invaluable. This is stuff where, you absolutely need to read the documentation. You absolutely want to read the DBT documentation and know what's happening with it. So no, I mean, I do think it's going to be a lot more facility, for, the next time around, even if I want to keep working on attendance and absences, but even if approaching a completely different topic.
Yeah, for me, I think here I might want to use an old Chinese saying. It says, "A skill is never a burden." So now I feel not only I learned SQL, but also I know how to use Snowflake and know the EdFi data, which I believe is quite easily transferable to any other projects that I will undertake in the future.
Yeah, and I just wanted to call out, Mike has mentioned DBT docs a couple of times. I think Kayla did talk about this on the last episode, but just in case any of our listeners now didn't listen to that one. Ross, do you want to say just a few sentences about what DBT docs is in terms of documentation? And then Mike, I would also like you to talk a little bit about what DBT docs doesn't have and what you and I have been talking about as our ideal documentation scenario.
Absolutely. So as part of our tooling, we have adopted DBT, which is a transformation tool. It allows us to go from source data that we capture from EdFi and then stage it through multiple stages, do things like quality control, add in tests and checks of data that we would like to see, organize it into structures that are more apt for downstream analytical uses. And then we use that same technology to build our downstream analytical models. As part of that tooling, it offers the ability to output a set of web-based documentation that encapsulates all the code that you've written. And it gives you a human readable format where you can look at the lineage of the data elements that you're looking at within the model that you're currently looking at. You can also go up the chain and figure out where did this data come from? What are the upstream models? What are the upstream data sources? What are the downstream models that depend on the model that you're currently exploring? It allows you to be able to evaluate and suss out why a particular model might be empty, because you can look upstream and figure out, okay, this table from EdFi is empty, and so this is not going to build, or it's going to be missing this particular column. And then you can add in, as a developer, additional documentation that gives further context than what is just derived from the out-of-the-box documentation. So it's a native tool to the DBT toolkit that allows for human-readable output of the work that's being done in code. And you can host it on the web, and you can access it. When you use DBT locally, you can compile it and read it on your own machine. It's pretty handy, and also it interfaces with data governance tools that can then leverage the information within DBT docs to then output to other tools that can then be woven together with your other governance-y type activities. Whether you're creating standard operating procedures, you can refer back to what you encapsulated in your DBT documentation. So it's fairly powerful, DBT as a toolkit, but this DBT docs also saves a lot of time and effort in just revealing to a human being what work is being done under the hood.
And just to reiterate or say real quick, I'm not sure if you said this exactly, but the DBT docs updates as changes are made in the underlying system, right, Rosh? So updates to DBT docs do not have to be made manually. Correct me if I'm saying any of that wrong.
It depends on how your build pipeline is created, but generally that's true. When you push out a new build, the docs will update to reflect the contents of that new build. Whether or not you're also pushing it to your web server where those docs are hosted, that's a separate step. But on the natural, every time you rebuild the project and you have new code, it does account for that in the docs that are generated.
Yeah. So for example, we recently deployed the de-identified schema in a couple of our data environments. And now that schema shows up in the list of schemas. And it generally just refers back to the original tables with some changes, but the updating nature of that, I think, is very different from what we currently often get in research documents.
It's really exciting to hear about that. All right, like at this point, my understanding of DBT is, more functional and actually hearing about the depth you can get in DBT from Rosh is really really exciting. I know that you were talking to me about like, well, what do you like in documentation? And what I'm used to is often, you have these code books, right? Especially if you're working with these big public data sets like the current population survey that, list the variables, list all the different values that they can take, say that, look, this is populated for these students, this is populated for these other students. So it does almost make me wonder if the difference is less a matter of detail and more a matter of just even packaging the similar information in different ways, one in a way that researchers are used to and one in a way that technologists are used to. That may be a substantial part of the difference. Maybe road mapping it, because a lot of code books roadmap and give a whole atlas of the data that you're looking at. Obviously, we are dealing with something really huge here. Like, a data set that would have, in the case of absences, like data by student, by course, by day, including absences and reasons for absences. When you talk about that kind of scale, maybe that's even a bigger enterprise than you might get with say other data sets that are sort of more prepackaged, more constant, more fixed than the ever evolving work that you have in data warehousing. This is really exciting to hear about, Rosh. I really appreciate you talking about this kind of detail.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about leveraging tools that have a very robust community and are being used in a wide range of industries. And so when you are an industry ranging set of tools, you have to be able to generate those artifacts that are consumable by lots of different types of practitioners. And so when it comes to the additional material that you can add in the DBT docs, that may be like an intersection point between the different teams here within EA to say, okay, we're ready to hand it off. Prior to doing that, what should we insert into the DBT docs that also helps stakeholder A and stakeholder B? And it allows you to do that. So it's really nice.
Sara, did you want to add anything to what Mike described as his experience?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the DBT is really helpful. It saves researchers or all the stakeholders so much time in trying to connect all those tables. So I was still wondering if, but maybe something that is out of beyond the scope of the DBT, like for instance, creating attendance rate, thanks to Mike. But before that, I really had little information on how to create this attendance rate by course section. And also like the question I first ran into, if I just want to summarize all the courses offered in different schools, different districts that have totally different names, how can I use any means to get a summary of all those courses. So I don't think those are available in the DBT, but of course it's much deeper and the users might not be that big. Maybe only researchers are interested in this kind of questions. So I think that's probably beyond the scope of our conversation right now.
I don't think it's beyond the scope. I think it's very relevant to, if we want researchers to feel more comfortable using these data and, make sure that the use is correct and that which ways you need to slice the data to get, a correct, accurate result. I think that's really key. So if you have more to say about that, I think you should feel free.
Certainly, yeah. I believe the more people who use this data will generate an even bigger knowledge pool that we can share, and that really will help the usage of this platform.
I can speak about that a little bit from being on the ground and involved with this data for several years now. There is an element of if you've ever watched The Matrix, in the beginning, in the first movie, it's like Neo's very clunky and is not able to really do all the things that he has claimed to be able to do. But then at the end of the movie, he can kind of like see all the code. And that's how I feel now in terms of looking at EdFi data. It's taken several years to get there. But Sarah, to your point, is there is an element of sometimes it's hard to identify the various I'll use the word quirks about the data in a global way. One, because there are differences from geography to geography that sometimes we don't even know from the outset, and the structure of the data doesn't even offer any insight into. And it's not until you actually get into the contents can you figure that out. So I would say that there's always going to be a baseline level of norming that will be necessary whenever we expand into a new geography or work with a new partner. There'll be some level of that. I don't think that will ever go away regardless of documentation. What we can do, though, is going back to the analogy that was used at the beginning of the podcast, is we can be more targeted about saying, hey, make sure you look in this area for this to happen. I always like when Google Maps has this road is closed, so that I don't mistakenly try to turn onto a road that's closed. So if we identify, hey, this is an area where we've seen a lot of variance in the field, something like how school codes are recorded or how classes are described, those are the kinds of callouts that we could put into documentation. And after having some reps, you kind of start to realize what those areas are. And as you get more familiar with the type of client that you're working with, you can kind of start to intuit those locations. But from the jump, I think it's really important that as you all are getting more and more experience and repetitions in working with EdFi-based data, calling out those areas to just say, hey, here's a pitfall, or here's an actual shortcut for you to get at this thing, is as valuable as describing the data structure itself. Is more saying, here are the potential areas where you can be pulled off of your course, and I'm here to help you correct. So we invite as much of that as possible, is to say, here is something that can help somebody in the future, and I had to learn the hard way. And sometimes I can testify that I've been bad about that in the past. And sometimes you're on a call and you're like, oh yes, I remember this. And if I had just noted that down for a project somewhere, then maybe a person in working with that partner would have realized that earlier. So it's a well taken point, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your insights. I really like your analogy of the matrix, and we all recognize this is a work in progress, and we're just so excited to be on this journey and to contribute wherever we can.
One of the nice things about working with these data, and this is sort of getting to what I think some of the things we're talking about, is the extent to which it's disaggregated, right? Like I said, like we had just a volume of data. And it's not just a volume in the sense that it's got all the students and all the courses, that you have, in public schools for a state, but you can get at it at a level of detail, which means that if you're going to work with an aggregation, like if you're going to work with a kind of attendance rate, you can decide what that rate is going to be, because like I said, you have attendance data by student, by course, by day. So if I want to break it out by, what time of the year the attendance was made, or the extent to which, how many of the students' peers were absent on the same day an individual student was absent, you can do that. And that's different from, I would say, more standard research data sets where a lot of the aggregation is done for you, which in some cases can save time. It's like, I just want an attendance rate. Okay, well, here it is. That's it. I can move forward with that. And maybe that is something that can be done with data warehouses, is to have some, aggregated data so that people who want to skip that step can do it. But in other cases, more standard data sets, the aggregation is done for you, and someone else has decided what those aggregates are going to be, so that, you might have some of the aggregates that you want, you might not have some of the other aggregates you want. Here, you do have the ability to create the measure that you specifically want. And that's great because it also opens up, very specific research questions that can emerge, from having the data, quite so disaggregated. And so it's not just even a matter of volume of just, how much there is in there, but just the extent of detail. I think I felt like that was one of the best things about being able to go into this, data warehouse, and just seeing what you can do is to get, very much the specific variable that you can get to the extent that it could possibly be had.
And you tracked some statistics or some results for me about the time that it took you to run some of those data, right? We were trying to figure out if this was a time-saving effort. So I don't know if you recall any of those observations, but if you do, that'd be great to hear as well.
Yeah, well, that's actually an example, and I think that comes out of Snowflake a lot, as opposed to doing it on the statistical software itself. Because, if you think about it, right, daily attendance data, not just by student, but by course, that's absolutely massive. And the idea of trying to download a data set of that and working with that in desktop statistical software is really daunting. Working in Snowflake, though, and like I said, to give an example, like one of the variables I wanted was, I not only wanted to know, the extent to which students were absent, but I wanted to know the extent to which their classmates in a given course were absent on the day that individual student was absent, a measure of peer absence rate on days of own absence. And, that involved taking something like 15 million attendance events by student, course, and day, for a sample of ninth graders in a given year. And I could get that measure, that measure of peer absence on days absence in about 11 minutes, creating 2.1 million observations in Snowflake. That's a lot faster than I think I would have gotten with desktop statistical software. So that's another one, is just having the speed of Snowflake in being able to compute the variables and the aggregates that you're trying to get. Not least, the warehouse itself giving you data so granular that you can get that aggregate in the first place.
I think that is also important to mention in the aspect of, like, the form of the data being in a warehouse versus downloaded and then uploaded into your software. At EA, we have a connector between our data warehouse and our studio instance. And so that data never has to be downloaded or uploaded. And as someone who also has tried downloading attendance data, like Mike is talking about, it is massive, and IT will not be pleased with you. So that brings up another question, though, about, like, generalizing, which we haven't really talked much about, generalizing research use of EdFi data outside of our own organization, but that is an interest of our organization, is to work with external researchers as well, and try to bring this kind of format and really granular and high quality aspect and quick turnaround of data to others in the education research field. So these are things that have come up for us when we're thinking about trying to make that happen, is how do we get data to someone who, isn't part of our organization's data sharing agreement with the partner who owns the data, or who can't log into our servers to access that directly. These are all things that we're working through right now. I think that we have a real advantage here of being able to run things on the warehouse itself, versus maybe not having direct access. One other question that I wanted to ask you both before we finish up is, again, thinking about Kayla's episode several weeks ago. Here at EA, we have a research team and we have an analyst team. And sometimes they do similar things, but they do have distinct roles. And I'd be interested to hear Mike and Sara, hear you talk about that relationship, especially as you both get more familiar with the EdFi data. Like, how has that relationship been beneficial to you? What do the analysts do and specialize in that have made your job getting into this research easier? Anything like that. I think the sort of exploratory and data science aspect of these enormous data sets housed in a data warehouse requires a different skill set. And we have those two groups kind of working closely together. And I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear about that relationship and, what is needed from, like, what is the universe of skills that are really needed to work with this kind of data.
Well, I mean, I think one difference between what the research team and the analyst team does is that I think the research team is often very involved in, determining research questions, figuring out what, the best method is to tackle a question like that. And that comes from our expertise and experience as researchers, right? Having the idea about, knowing what questions we're going to be looking into, what technique you use, whether it's, quantitative in my case, qualitative, in the cases of other researchers, and saying, well, what evidence can you put together to answer these questions? What various methods can we use to accomplish them? The analysts have, great facility with data. They have great, facility with programming. And I know in this particular case, like I said, I had an idea about what I'd like to measure, and some of that came from seeing what kind of data was available, in the warehouse to do it. But as far as even knowing, again, how to start, I learned a lot from documentation that the analysts put together, from talking to the analysts, learning from them. But even talking about use, right? Like I have a functional knowledge of SQL, right? I mean, I learned SQL as a part of this. But what I know is pretty functional. I can write SQL code that works. I don't know if it's going to be the best possible code, if it's going to be the most efficient possible code. That's something that analysts are really good at, of like saying, this is the best way to program this up. And this is even true when I'm not working in the data warehouse, where I'm working in say R or something like that. I mean, I can program in R. The analyst can program in R a lot better than I can. So that's an example, I would say, about how the analysts are useful. Maybe keeping up with our downtown analogy. These are tour guides, these are locals, these are the person working at the hotel desk to tell you, you want to go this way if you want to get to the part of town with the restaurants. You want to go this way if you want to, if you want to take this train, if you want to get to this office downtown, and things like that. So that would be an area where I would say that, like, where the analyst team, who are just an absolutely terrific group that we have at EA, can collaborate with the research team as far as getting to conducting research here internally at EA, or facilitating work with external partners, toward using the data warehousing and the data infrastructure to answer research questions.
Yeah, for me, I think like Mike said, to get me started, I also had to rely upon the documentation provided by the analysts. And they have a very high level of specialization. They write so beautiful code, much better than I can write in terms of SQL. And I do believe that our collaboration is very helpful in terms of maximize the production we can get for EA. Just recently, I'm working on another ETC evaluation work, and I tried to use ChatGPT to help me generate some graph. But in the meantime, I was just experimenting. Of course, I had to rely upon analysts to give me the visuals. And I find out that our analysts are way better than the ChatGPT can do in terms of rationalizing those what the visuals would look like and how to tweak them. So I have a very deep respect for their skills, and I really appreciate this environment that we can always work collaboratively to help each other.
I'm curious because we do have this goal of having partnerships with external researchers, at different universities or different research organizations. Knowing that those folks may not have access to our analyst team and that knowledge base there, what kind of things would you recommend that people be aware of, or as we are thinking about documentation for external users, what do we need to include in that to make sure that even external folks can fully understand the data sets and answer, write code that will analyze those questions accurately?
I think descriptive documentation can be really useful, right? I mean, just literally knowing what data are out there, knowing what the grain of the data set are. I know that's an important part of DBT documentation, and an idea that I just find, to be immensely useful. Knowing that these data can be put together, very easily, given the key variables. I would say descriptive statistics. I would say description, good descriptions of the data. Because actually, if I'm doing studies with something like the current population survey, that's the first place I go. I don't just crack open the data, in part because the data sets are really big, even in the current population survey, but just look at the code books. Like, just go look through the data dictionaries, look through what other descriptions there are of the data. Sometimes you even get descriptive statistics, to the extent that you can share that and say, look, here's our data on, say, this variable, and then, look and seeing, okay, and the people who have values for these data are the people who have these values for these other variables in the data set. So I think that, easy to follow, or maybe not even easy to follow, but detailed, documentation that just spells out what variables that you're looking at, what variables that you would have access to. I think that could get really far. I think that'd be a really useful thing to have.
Mike, what do you think of, sorry, Sarah, one real quick follow-up question. How much do you think the operational aspect of the data in our EdFi data warehouses impacts that? Sometimes we will have really weird values that we should get rid of, or, we could have a descriptive statistic of how many times each thing, is in the data, but you really have to know the context of the data to know whether those things are all legitimate, legitimate values for those fields. And that can really vary by partner. And if we think about our statewide partner, South Carolina, different districts may input certain fields with different language. So that would be a pretty big lift to like validate all of those things. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to deal with the operational nature of the data and knowing that you're not necessarily going, like, you're going to have to figure out what parts of the data to exclude and write business rules around. And yeah, there's a question in there somewhere.
That's a good question. Even one that may be a little bit out of date could still be really useful, though, right? Just even to get a sense of the basic feel of the data. You're right that the business rules aspect of it, of just saying, no, really exclude every observation where this is equal to 99, you know what I mean? Or something like that, right? I mean, that's always an important thing to do. And that is going to be part of, what it's going to be like, working from this at, a greater distance than just getting right in there and just seeing the data itself. That's an interesting question. I do feel like more detailed documentation can get you really far. I do think you're right. You do bring up an interesting point about getting to that last part of it.
Sarah, did you want to add anything about that last question? Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. So you talk about how can we help external researchers to get on board. I was thinking maybe a list of publications or work in progress using EdFi data so that new researchers, if they happen to conduct a similar research and they need help, they may know where to go.
Yeah, I also think it would be fantastic to have our analyst team think about a set of external, resources that could be used externally as well. But that's probably a little ways down the road. My last question is really looking towards the next steps for the future. I know, Mike, you have some planned additional analyses for your original research area. Sarah, I don't know if you do as well, but it'd be interesting to know what you each are planning to do next.
Sure, I'll go first. So the study that I wrote was about the impacts of absences on course grades, right? That was what I was able to use as the outcome because it was a different variable to use. Most studies about absences are using test assessment scores as their outcome, and this was a chance to just look at something different, in this case, course grades. So the model that I ran, again, it would be the impact of absences on course grades. In the model that I used, I put course fixed effects in there because I felt like if I had to do that, right? Because some courses are going to be more leniently or more difficultly graded than others. And so I felt like, okay, I've got to put those course fixed effects in there to explicitly control for that. I didn't have student fixed effects in there because the unit of observation I had would be the combination of a student and a course. And the reason that's the case is not because I didn't want to put student fixed effects in there. It was just because it's just really econometrically difficult to put in, tens of thousands of course fixed effects and then put in tens and thousands of student fixed effects in there as well. But I wanted to, control for that in some way. And I think I have an idea of an empirical strategy to be able to do that. But what that does is actually reveal another nice thing about having these course data that you get from someplace like our data infrastructure, which is that I don't just have across student variance to work with to try to estimate. And in fact, I also have within student across course variance to work with as well. And the idea is then if I can control for the across student variance, if I can control for the across course variance and try to specifically look at the interaction of student and course, I might get something that's a little bit closer to a causal effect. And I think, again, that just speaks to, the advantages you can get from the granularity of the data and from the, volume of data that you have to work with. Second thing I'd like to do is when I broke out, results, one of the areas that I looked at was, reason for absence, but whether it was an excused absence for medical reason, excused absence for non-medical reasons, and so on. But the data are more detailed than that, so excused medical, that was an aggregation that I did, but, the data says, were you excused because of COVID? Were you excused because of flu? And I think there was one other for the medical absences, and there was a bigger breakout for the non-medical ones. It'd be really interesting to get a really granular idea about, how does the reason for absence interact with the impact of an absence on a student outcome like course grades. So to get some really detailed results, I think that'd be really interesting too.
Yeah, for me, I talk about my current research and the future research plan. So my pilot study looked at whether more effective teachers have an impact on student attendance. Using the EdFi-based course section attendance data, I tried several estimation approaches, including traditional OLS and a few double machine learning methods, to see if the relationship held up across models. In the end, the results were pretty consistent. There is essentially no meaningful relationship between teacher value added and student attendance. Right now, I'm planning to explore a few additional angles, but the takeaway so far is that teacher value added doesn't seem to move the needle on attendance outcomes. During this process, one question that really stuck with me as I dug deeper into the data was how we might use the granularity or specifics of the EdFi system and modern machine learning tools to build a more refined early warning system for chronic absenteeism and ultimately dropout prevention. We know from previous research that persistent chronic absenteeism is one of the strongest predictors of a dropping out, and that absenteeism itself is shaped by a complex mix of individual, family, and school factors. Of course, building a model like that would require longitudinal attendance data and additional context, such as school climate or engagement measures, which may not yet be available. But the potential to develop that kind of early warning system is really exciting.
I totally agree. And I think we are probably likely to have another podcast episode, maybe within the next year, where we, start digging into things using machine learning models a bit more. And so hopefully we'll be able to get an update from you on whether you're able to investigate that question, which sounds really fascinating. I realize now that we are at time. So I thank you both so much for all of the interesting work that you've done on this so far, and also to be willing to come on the podcast and talk about it. Rosh, do you have any last questions or thoughts before we sign off?
Yeah, absolutely. This was always part of the dream when Molly and I both first got into this work, was to do research enablement at scale. And to see, just even to hear the kinds of thoughtful, well-executed approaches that you both have been taking and the rest of our team members are taking is really heartening. And we're starting to see the results of years and years of investment in this area come to bear fruit. So thank you all for the role that you're playing in that. And I'm excited to see what the future holds for the students that we get to work with.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.